Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from City Talk. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute. Really pleased to have us all back together where I am in Toronto. Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, including Inuit and Métis people from across Turtle Island. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we always want to commence these broadcasts with a reminder of our debt and our obligation to find ways to reconcile and understand the truth of our history as settlers and immigrants and newcomers and Indigenous. And we try to hold those conversations in recognition of that. At the same time, we also hold these conversations recognizing that there are still thousands and thousands of Canadians around the country, and Americans, because Tim, you're joining us from the US, and Americans who are on the front line saving lives, trying to keep people safe. And these conversations are not a substitute or in any way intended to distract us from that struggle that continues, being particularly felt by municipal governments and First Nations governments around the continent. CUI has been, since COVID, trying to build new forms of connective tissue that allow city builders in different environments to communicate with one another, so we can learn and adapt and adjust more quickly and to what the challenges are. And we're joined today by 4 practitioners who are going to give us their perspective on the ground about what they're seeing around a very particular topic of transportation and transit, and what's the future of mobility. Urban environments are dependent on mobility, and there are so many topics to unpack here. Since COVID, CUI has been focused on these different platforms. This one is City Talk Canada. There are 2 others, City Watch Canada and City Share Canada. Just, Tim, just in case you didn't know, we're in Canada. Those platforms all have that route at the end and the extension.ca. And these are powered by volunteers and partners across the country. So if you've got capacity to help us, we really would appreciate it. This is an all hands on deck moment. We've been very, very fortunate to have hundreds of folks helping, watching cities, sharing what's going on, trying to make sense of it as these City Talk things do. I'm completely impressed with the numbers of people that continue to turn out for City Talk sessions live here, even on nice sunny days. And just so you know, we post these things after the fact on City Talk Canada, CanUrb. You'll find them there. We post a recording. We post a transcript. We post some takeaways that we have students who are helping us to pull out 5 or 6 key things from each one. And we also post what people say in the chat. So we would encourage people who are listening and want to participate. You can you can write questions and comments, and you can post resources in that chat function. And you'll see you have a choice in the chat function to send to all panelists and everyone. So if everyone could now go and change that toggle so that everyone sees what you're posting. And we often find that there's a whole world of discourse that lives on in the chat, kind of peripheral to what you all are going to be talking about. And that's really great. And people answer each other's questions, and they put up resources, and it's terrific. But just a heads up that what goes in the chat stays in the chat. So it gets posted. So just be aware that lots of people will read it. And also just saying, you know, as I suggested, we've had, I think we're in our, jeepers, I've lost count now, but I think we're in our 25th of these sessions since COVID started. They're all being posted, and lots of people go back and read them and see them again. They seem to have a lot of shelf life. That's valuable, I think, for us to understand how we've evolved through the trajectory of this, and it appears as if we're going to be in it for a while. So we'd encourage you, and if you want to go out and sit on your balcony and you don't want to do this midday or early in the morning, you can watch us at 10 at night or 11 at night and still participate and still engage. These conversations are also just the beginning. We don't see them as the finite thing. They kick off interesting discourse that's going to take a long time for us to figure out, right? So if you want to continue to participate with us, hashtag City Talk, use Twitter and whatever social media you have available to you. And certainly you can always email us at covidresponse@canurb.org. We often say that when we have these sessions, that people here that come on these sessions with us, you're participating as individuals. So you may have clients, you may have an employer, You may have a constituency that you're affiliated with, but we always encourage people to feel liberated and not just to talk as individuals. It's a complicated time for everybody, and we're all just trying to make sense of it. So we encourage you to speak freely and candidly, and similarly that everybody cuts everybody some slack here, that it's pretty difficult to speak on behalf of anyone at the moment because none of us is really sure where this is all ending up. Okay, so I think we'll just start. As I suggested, the focus is today on a topic that is on everyone's minds. We're viscerally experiencing it. Cities are dependent on connection, different forms of connection. We're in the connective tissue business at CUI, but it's really true at local neighborhoods. And what is it going to look like if you can't get around, or if you can't get around the way you used to be able to get around? And what are the implications for that? So I've asked everybody here to identify themselves and tell us where they are, where they're participating from, and particularly the neighborhood they're in. And we'll start with 90 seconds from each of you about what have you been seeing? What do you think is the really dominant thing that is impressing upon you through the crisis? You can talk about the last 10 weeks if you like, and you can also talk about what you're seeing right now. So I think I'm going to go first. We often do this. We go to our visitor because, you know, we're polite, hospitable Canadians. We go to our visitor first. So Timothy Papandreou, you're there in the Mission District in San Francisco. So, and Tim, you travel all around the world talking about the future of transportation, and now you're going nowhere. So can you just tell us what you've been seeing, what have you been observing, and tell people a little bit about yourself and what you think, okay?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. And yeah, it's been a really weird time. I've had a weird year. I don't need to hide it, but I lost my mother at the beginning of this year in Australia, and I had to go backwards and forwards for a bunch of things there. In the meantime, we had massive bushfires in Australia, and we're coping with that while my mother was in ICU, and then COVID was rising really quickly while she was still in hospital. Came back to Australia, had to go to London and backwards and forwards, and it was a real messy time. March 14th, we had lockdown in San Francisco, the first municipal region in the country to really force the shelter in place. And I haven't really left the neighborhood since. And to be honest, it's been wonderful to be able to like sit still and just deal with all this stuff that's happened with the family and everything else, while working really diligently on what does this look like for transportation and everybody around me. So, you know, I think we'll talk about this in the chat today. The big things are people who could work from home are still working from home. People who had to go to work and were deemed essential workers are risking their lives for us every day so that we could actually still get our services and our things delivered to us. Public transport has been basically decimated. It doesn't really have the capacity allowance that it used to have before. And people aren't driving, and if they are driving, they're driving very little. One of the things that's really noticeable is on the shared mobility front. That's the car sharing and the electric bikes and scooters, etc. They basically were either suspended or paused. One of the services in San Francisco was deemed an essential service, so people could still use that. They had to quickly figure out how to keep the handlebars sanitary, how to keep the contact minimalized on the public transit system. They didn't allow people entering the front doors. If you didn't need an essential trip, you couldn't use public transport. That's still the case today. We have a saying here, I stay home so others can get to work if they need to, and that's a really big push. We also have a situation here where while some traffic is coming back, it's not the commuter peak traffic, because that are mainly the, let's call them the professional white collar workers who are still asked to work from home. And those that are in the office environment, especially in your world, in the urban realm form, are really questioning the idea of what is commercial real estate going to look like, especially in the central city cores where they're basically bona fide office parks. You know, they're basically these big oversized office parks. They're not really neighborhoods. And so will we see a shift in how we utilize these buildings? Many of the companies that I'm working with are struggling in terms of like, they can't have the reduced capacity and bring everybody back into the office building. They also are realizing that these plexiglass shields and things may not actually work. So just redesigning the entire travel journey from home to the destination, but also the journey within the building. So minimizing contact, minimizing touch. And, you know, I'll just close by saying we're social creatures. We love, this is how we thrive. We interact, we touch, we handshake, we do all these things. But a lot of that's going to have to change if we're going to have a different approach. So a lot of upheaval, a lot of changes. There's been a lot of companies that are pivoting. The ride-hailing companies like the Ubers, et cetera, they're pivoting to deliveries. The delivery services, the Instacarts and those kinds of companies, they're doing exceptionally well because they were primed for this this pivot. But who knows how long that'll stay for? One thing that we do know in transportation is that there are long arcs of trends and there are short disruptions and bursts. And we're in a, even if this happens for the next 12 to 24, even 30 months, it's still a short burst compared to the long arc, which is the major trend shifting towards more sharing, more electrification, and more automation. And we've seen that happen across the world. So that's the long-term trends, and they'll still keep moving. But right now, it's been just abruptly and shifting because of the immediate triage that we're in.
Timothy, when you go out your door in the mission, are the trolleys running?
So the MTA has basically suspended all rail services and just using buses. And so they have the regular buses or the electric trolley buses, but they're at a really reduced capacity. They actually over a weekend restructured the entire transit system and only operated the core services, and like an 85-90% reduction in the actual lines that they were operating, and just focused on the core lines. It's given them a really good opportunity to just test and see like what is really the core system. And I think a lot of agencies around the world right now are in that phase, or in that triage phase of what does the core network look like and how do we keep that going? Because of safe distancing, they can only have a minimum amount of people on the bus, so they may actually have to run more frequency just to keep that service going. So yeah, that's what we're seeing in our area. More walking, which is great, more cycling, which is great. We have these slow streets that are opening up everywhere and allowing people to safe distance and safe walk. We have, 5 or 6 right now and about a dozen in the pike to be launched. A lot of opportunity to also create open air areas for restaurants that are opening up this week and allowing them more space outside, because a restaurant can't make do on 20% capacity. It doesn't make sense for them. So allowing them to have half of their capacity out on the street, to me, creates an amazing opportunity to reclaim all that space. So it's an interesting time because there are a lot of issues behind that. What works for some communities doesn't work for other communities. So this whole key thing is about talking with the community and finding out what do they really need, and how does this, if anything, is any of this going to help them, or do they really need economic development tools which are much more tactical and less transportation related, or are they actually the same in the one?
Well, and it depends on how you're defining community, of course, because some people are suggesting that doing what you're suggesting on restaurants is actually privatizing space and displacing people that actually use the street differently now. So anyway, you've raised a whole bunch of issues that we'll come back to as we go.
Right.
So let's now go to Tania. I'm sort of swinging from the west to the east. So let's go to Tania Wegwitz, who's joining us from, I love this neighborhood, Tania. It's the Independent Republic of Fernwood.
Yeah.
In Victoria.
Victoria. Yeah, for sure.
So tell us what you're seeing and what you've been observing. And I know your scope, like Tim's, is broader than just the community you live in. So tell us briefly what you've been seeing.
Yeah, so I work with primarily transit is something that I focus on. Also do transportation demand management and active modes as well. But in turn, maybe I'll speak to transit and pick up on some of the themes that Tim's speaking to. What we've seen for transit systems, big and small, and I want to reiterate that we often, when we're thinking about transit and the impacts of COVID, we tend to think of the Torontos and Montreals and Vancouvers, but it is hitting transit systems of every scale and every scope. And what we saw was early in April, many of them did rapid reductions, adjustments to service levels, cleaning protocols, becoming fare free, changing their boarding procedures. So a lot of change very quickly to adapt to changing travel patterns and also just lower ridership and the need to space people out. Since that time right now, we're kind of in a phase where, at least in many Canadian jurisdictions, the reopening is happening. Over the last week or so, we've seen increases to transit ridership again, so in 16%, 17% realm.
And where's that, Tanya? Is that across the country?
Well, for instance, 16% up increase was in TransLink, 17% was, I believe, in Edmonton.
Okay.
London, Ontario was 12%. So these are some of the figures from the Canadian Urban Transit Association.
Yep.
What we've also been seeing too is that, so they're preparing for a return to fares. So across the 54 transit systems in BC Transit's jurisdiction, as well as TransLink in BC, fares return June 1st. Boarding procedures are changing, whereby plexiglass shields have been installed, and now people will be asked to board through the front doors and leave through the rear, unless they're using mobility aids of some kind. But however, there's some transit systems that are struggling. So what we're hearing for some communities is that you can't keep up with demand to have those shields installed. And so that is then impacting the ability to return to service there. And also the other piece is looking ahead, what does this mean to revenues? So funding is a huge piece that communities, municipalities are dealing with on all fronts. For transit in particular, it's impacting looking forward and the service levels that you might be able to provide. And where is that missing funding going to come from if the fuel tax revenues are down, fare revenues are down, and so forth? And then I think the other piece that I think people are just starting to grapple with is transit typically is a longer time frame in terms of when you start the process, hear from the public, adapt your service levels and put in new service. And now what's happening is that changes are needing to happen on a far more frequent basis, and we don't know. Post-secondary institutions may or may not return to class levels in September. The commuter peak that we would typically see is all gone. And really, you're looking to try and adjust service levels on a week-by-week basis. And what does that look like? And how do your monitoring processes adapt to that? And how do you get the word out? And then I guess finally, as well, is for all frontline staff, for your passengers, how do we continue to ensure ongoing mental health support, ongoing care, all those things?
Yeah, it's this isn't easy. It's big, lots of Gordian knots here. Okay, let's go next, if we can. We're going to move our way across the country. So to Howaida Hassan, who's in the Malmo neighborhood of Edmonton. Yes, and what's the weather like in Edmonton today, Howaida? What is it? I mean,
it's chilly and rainy. I wish I could say that it was sunny and beautiful, but it's chilly and rainy. But it was beautiful over the weekend for those who were celebrating. It was the end of Ramadan, so it was Eid on Sunday, and it was beautiful weather for us here. Yeah. It was a funny, socially distanced kind of Eid. Normally, we would congregate and be at, with other families at mosques, but that wasn't happening. But it was still okay. We're all happy and healthy and celebrating at home.
How did people get through Ramadan? How did people, before you go to the transpiration piece, just tell us how people got through Ramadan in Edmonton. How were you able to observe it? We heard that the city of Mississauga, for instance, allowed a daily call to prayer to be broadcast through the whole population through Ramadan, which was controversial, but I think largely very much supported as a signal of appreciation of diversity. Tell us what it's been like in Edmonton on that regard. Just take a minute before you do your other thing.
Yeah, for sure. So my other job, and not quite a job, but a volunteer position, is I'm president of the Islamic Family Social Services Association here in Edmonton. So we provide social services to the community. We've been around for about a quarter century, really great organization. So I've had the privilege of being on some calls with mosques and that kind of thing, just kind of trying to figure out what we would be doing for Ramadan. And there was almost like quite a sense of loss and sadness, actually, that we weren't going to be able to congregate during the month. And it is about the fast, of course, and that's a solitary type of endeavor, but you're part of a larger community when you're doing it, and you know that. And it helps when you can see people at the end of your fast break fast together, that kind of thing. So that was difficult. However, just like some other cities, like you mentioned, Mississauga, here in Edmonton, our city council did permit also some mosques to have the call to prayer at sundown, and just making sure that they were within the sound bylaw limitations and things like that. So that was really nice, actually. I felt like that was a really nice symbolic thing for the community, the Muslim community, to have happen. So I was really pleased with that. And I know a lot of people in the community appreciated that gesture as well. So that was really nice. And it was one of those things that I think people needed a bit of an uplift during the month, just given how strange things were. So that was really fantastic.
Yeah, it seems these rituals and observances, we're going to have to figure this out going forward. And how do we accommodate our communal life in a way that isn't so communal? Okay, well, thank you for just filling us in on that and how it's been experienced in Edmonton. Okay, now you actually work for the city, so you have a bird's eye here about what the challenges are to running a transit system. And both Kim and Tania have given hints about this. It ain't easy. So talk to us about Edmonton and what you're sensing is going to be what's the challenge?
Yeah, for sure. So for clarity, I do work more in the long range planning. So I was part of the team that developed the city's draft city plan just most recently. So, and I was leading up the transportation master plan piece of that. So we were thinking more long-term, thinking about resiliency, thinking about disruptions to our system. We didn't mention pandemic in particular in our plan, but had thought of what kind of disruptions the plan could withstand and how it could endure. Having said that, I think like looking at what has happened to our transit system has been humbling. We've had quite a reduction in ridership. I think we've been really responsive, like other cities. We've actually eliminated the fare, temporarily suspended fare payment, and that was to help with things like social distancing. We were actually already in the process of installing shields on all of the buses, more from a safety perspective for the bus drivers, but that has actually been a dual benefit in that it's provided that safety for the drivers as well in terms of social distancing. We've done back of the bus boarding. Every other seat must be unoccupied. So that's been really, it's interesting to see all those things happen. We've had, basically because of suspension of fare, there's been a $10 million per month reduction in revenue. It has not gone unseen, of course, by our council. There's a lot of people concerned about what that will mean long-term for transit, not least of all our mayor, who's been quite vocal about that in the news and really saying how concerned he is about those reductions. So that's what we've been seeing on that front. I've also been very positively impressed with how much we've been seeing people get on bikes and get out walking just like across the rest of the country. I recently just checked in with our folks who do our monitoring of traffic and cycling and that kind of thing. We saw in February we had 2,400 incidents of cycling in the city. That went up to 7,000 in May.
Wow.
So I'm super impressed with how people are really getting out there trying this new way. Oh, excuse my cat. I forgot to say that he might bomb the conversation at one point.
A feline bomb. Yeah, it's the best kind. Yeah.
So just really impressed with like people are really getting out there. And I guess where I'm hopeful is that people are trying active modes of transportation now that they have time to give it a chance and get out there and experience our city on 2 wheels instead of 4. I just feel like I'm hopeful that this will stick. It'll be part of people's psyche, and I mean, I don't know about you, but when I ride a bike, like there is kind of an emotional or like a psychological effect that takes place where you actually feel better, like physically, but also mentally. And I'm hoping that folks will retain those good vibes and want to continue that even as we go back to normalcy. And I'm confident that we'll go back to normalcy. But I'm hoping that we'll retain some of these things.
Yeah, mandatory endorphin boosts or something. Yeah, we'll come back to some of this because I want to go back to Tim's point about I stay home so others can get to work notion and who can get on a bike and who can't, and all that stuff. Okay, thanks, Howaida. Ahmed, El-Geneidy, talk to us. You're in Montreal. I think you're in Pointe Claire, right?
Yeah.
Lovely. Glad to have you. Tell us what you've been observing, could you?
So I'll speak on two things that we have been observing. In the public transit side, Montreal was like fast on doing the backdoor boarding and doing cleaning measures and increasing the cleaning capacity of the buses. It was a surprise how when we knew how frequently they were being cleaned before that. When they start, oh, we have to start cleaning every day. I was like, weren't you cleaning every day?
Yeah, right.
It's like that. So Montreal was on the upfront, and when it came to the measures in transit, I remember, like we closed on a Friday, and Monday morning, the backdoor boarding was in place. People applying it on the buses, trying to make the drivers safe. In terms of the service, we didn't cut service. Now we're seeing the deficit coming in the budget for the transit because we didn't cut service, but it's important to us to keep the transit service at that level. On the other side, on the cycling and walking, I was surprised that Montreal wasn't doing anything for a long time, and we kept waiting, and it's like, why? Like the mayor is known to be pro-cycling, pro-walking kind of person, and then we were sealing some kind of radio silence, and then all of a sudden, May 15th, a big plan came out of cycling and walking. The numbers are, you cannot hold the numbers in your hands, how many exactly, but they're saying around 327 kilometers additional temporary bicycle facilities and pedestrian additions in the different sections of the city. They started, what came out on May 15th was really impressive. So it took them a little bit longer, but they came up with some solid things that you can go, if you go on the streets now in Montreal, you see them on the ground. You see the widening of sidewalks, and they make sure that in front of the stores that will open, people are standing, and they widen the sidewalk so people can walk easily back and forth. There are around 112 new kilometers of active transportation facilities. But one of the things that you can get confused, I did a walk on a couple of days ago to understand what's going on the ground in some sections, and then you find streets are closed, but you don't know if they're closed because of construction at the end of the street, or this is trying to make it for pedestrians and cycling. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's closed, and people can you see people cycling. A lot of people Saturday and Sunday, the weather was very good, so the parks were open, people were socially distancing. But the major thing that I feel positive about was the scale and the quick implementation between like the announcement in May 15th and today was really impressive by the city. I was unhappy before May 15th, but when I saw the announcement, I went on the ground, saw it, that was impressive actually, and you see people are using it and people getting used to a new normal.
You've had 11 days. You've had 11 days of happiness since May 15th.
Yes, I can tell you that for sure, because before that there were radio silence totally from the city, nothing, and we were like, it's against the principles of the mayor. She is pro these things. Why? So actually, they were working on it. It took them a while, like a little bit longer than other places. We saw it coming in South America faster. So it's like, why aren't we doing it? And they had also succeeded to expedite a plan they had in the fall for an express bicycle network in Montreal on different axes in the region to have permanent bicycle facilities. So they expedited that. They got so we heard the announcement of that plan in the fall, and then there was public participations, and then we didn't see anything happening. Now, when the mayor came on the May 15th, she did the announcement of the 300 kilometers, they brought in also the details of the intersections, the designs, what's going to happen in this, and they are expediting this new REV, the REV system for the cycling and pedestrian. Another thing we started seeing people, you see that we have to start designing the bicycle facilities here for a family. And that's something new we started seeing here, is they are thinking about it more of a family. It's not going to be a commuting, going back and forth. The other aspects I saw when I went on, that I felt Montreal is behind, is at the intersections, the signals, we didn't change the traffic signals. No. So we give people distance between the intersections, and then they're all standing at the intersection next to each other.
Yeah.
So we did very well in that, but the intersections, we're still working, I think they're still working on it in terms of pedestrians and cyclists, because you find a lot of them all together at one spot. So the synchronization of the signals still needs work in that aspect.
So there's a whole bunch of things that you've all raised. First of all, can I just encourage people on the chat, if you could quickly just chunk in and tell us where you are, that'd be great. I see there's somebody from Ireland. If you've got a minute, just punch in and say where you are so we can see the breadth of where people are attending from today. There's so many issues that you've all, thank you. The chat people respond so quickly, thank you. It's just fantastic. You know, I think there's a dilemma. Transportation and transit is kind of a holding spot for a whole bunch of urban challenges, right? How do we pay for things? How do we negotiate shared space? What are the environmental implications? What are the economic and planning implications? And so it's hard to unpack it with 30 minutes of chat with you. But here's a question I've got around class and inclusion. Because I think this is a fundamental thing that we've seen through this, is that the people, Tim, I love this, I stay home so others can get to work. We had a nasty episode here in Toronto where it was a nice day and people crowded into one park and it caused a big uproar. But part of, I think, what it signaled to people was that there was a lack of empathy for how that would look and feel to someone who's on the transit going to a frontline job to try to keep people alive. And they go past this, what looks like a reckless kind of frivolous activity. So how are we going to come out of this in a way where people that must use transit to get to their job, how is that service going to be protected when we don't have enough money to do it? Is anybody grappling with the ethics of this? I've silenced all of you with my existence.
I'm super happy, Mary, that you brought up equity, because that's been on my mind a lot. And I think, so I've been having some conversations with my colleagues, and one of the things we've been talking about is how much privilege is actually embedded in the COVID rules. So around like, oh, only shop once a week. Okay, well, I can go and shop once a week for my family of 5, spend, $200, $250. But can another family on low income go do that? Likely not. They have to go every couple of days, get what they need when they have enough money to do so. This idea, I have a car, I have a job, I haven't been laid off. If you're in a service industry, you've likely been laid off. You're likely a woman. I just feel there's a lot of privilege embedded right with the rules themselves that we've created that maybe were unintended. And what I guess I'd like to see is that we don't embed that privilege post-COVID. Who is using our transit service? Who needs to get around? Where do they need to go? And let's make that easy. Like we have the tools. I know, like in Edmonton, we have some of the best transportation travel demand modeling tools that can actually tell us who is benefiting from the policy decisions we make by household income and that kind of thing. I think we need to start asking the right questions when we're using these tools.
I mean, Howaida, do you think, Tim, sadly you have to stay muted because there is ambulance activity in the mission, so when it's done you can unmute. But Howaida,
yeah,
is there a way going forward where we could prioritize routes and modes that are expressly designed to service the communities that have no other option? Is that a way to retilt this, you know, and that therefore people that have another option, they can walk or take a scooter or a bike or whatever, then they will have to take that. And then these services become expressly for people with no options. I don't know how to do that and not create a caste system, but you know what I mean? Is there a way to prioritize that?
I don't know if that's what I'd want to see, but rather I would want us to design our system with one of the indicators being equity.
Okay.
Meaning that, so we're doing exercises here in Edmonton where we're actually layering on, literally mapping out where are the overlaps between our traditionally low-income communities, our Indigenous communities, with where our best transit services. And lo and behold, it doesn't always match up, does it? And I mean, that's, I think, the thing across most cities, right? Because those that advocate for themselves will get, you know, better service typically, but you know, as a professional working at the city, I feel the obligation to think about not just those who are coming to us and expressing their need for new transit services, but those who might not have or be equipped with the means to be able to advocate in that way. So in my perspective, I think it's up to us we have the data, we know all this information about where people are living, where the origins and the destinations are, where the desire lines are, and we also have the characteristics of the people making those trips. You know, I led up the city's household travel survey back in 2015. We capture a lot of information about these households, and it's a good large sample. So it's no surprise to us who's making these trips, where are they going. So I think that we can design a system, not just with exclusive lines for people who need it, but a system that just generally reflects the composition of our society.
Okay, so Tim, the ambulances are gone. You're a tech advocate. Howaida is saying we've got the data. Can we find a way to create the responsive transit system, transportation mix that is going to reflect? I love what you just said, Howaida, desire lines. I love desire paths. Tim.
Yeah, I think Howaida is right on it. You know, we know what we need to do. We have the technology, we have the tools, we actually have the resources. It's the political will that we need. And I've seen this across the world. You know, the cities that are willing to put their money where their mouth is, their policy where their mouth is, they're doing stuff. Paris has put up 600 kilometers of active transportation routes because of they can't accommodate everybody on their transit system, and because of the fact that it's not available to everybody. But everybody can walk. Hopefully everybody can walk or roll or use some sort of assisted device. People are learning how to ride a bicycle because the sunk cost of a bicycle are in the hundreds of dollars, versus a car is $30,000-$40,000. So let's talk about that big equity gap between those who can drive and afford to drive and everybody else that cannot. And I really don't like how we pin transit as, if transit has too many riders, there's something wrong with it. If it doesn't have enough riders, there's something wrong with it. Transit is always beaten up, right? And transit is the only true public space we have that's fully democratized in our cities today. And to me, that should no longer be all about ridership. It's a public essential service that should be treated just like our water, our electricity, and something else. And so we need to refocus about what the role of public transit is and what is public transit. A bus coming every 30 minutes is not public transit, I'm sorry. A bus coming every 3 or 4 minutes that you can jump on and jump off to do your daily trips and services, as Howaida was mentioning, that's a public transit service. And so we need to look about like, what is important to us as values? How do we actually want to work in this space? And what does it actually mean to move a person from A to B? And not just from station to stop, which is what transit agencies do right now, but door to door. that may not be just a bus or a train. It may be a bicycle. It may be some other shared service. It may be a combination of those things. But we have the technology. We can route, book, and pay and connect it all together. And we even have ways to get people access to these services without a bank account or without even a data plan. These are no longer excuses that we should always say, well, there's an underbanked community. You can work with them and figure out ways to get them access if you want to. The question is, do we want to? And if we say we want to, then how we do it is just a process of how we do it. And it varies by community, and we can do that moving forward. But I want to go back to the point of the capacity issues with transit. In Taipei and in Seoul, they require masks, they require heat checks, they require temperature checks, and their ridership has gone back to where it was before COVID. Why? Because they do social tracing, and they do tracing of everybody. And in North America, we have this illusion of privacy, and we're scared of it, but that's how they're taking care of that issue. We have to really ask some hard questions about what kind of tools are we really willing to exercise, and how much of these things are we really willing to implement to see these outcomes that we say we want. And if equity isn't at the forefront of this, then we're just going to go back to the old normal, which I don't want us to do.
So I heard that subtle turn of phrase that you transportation wonks use, which is you just did transportation system became transportation service. So yes. This idea of mobility as a service, folks in the chat are picking this up. The dilemma, as you suggest, Tim, is that you're saying that it's like an essential aspect, an entitlement in urban life, like air, like water. And yet, do we have the political will? We have transit systems, Howaida works for one, that are threatened with bankruptcy now. Mm-hmm. So Tania, do you want to say something about this, about can we muster political will to understand how public money is going to have to be invested in sustainable ways to allow us to have transit and mobility services in cities across the country?
Yeah, I think that's totally it. And when we're talking about equity, we're also talking about accessibility. We're also talking about not just in the urban context, but rural and remote communities. So it's not just getting to the grocery store, 20 minutes away within an urban city. In some communities, they're small communities that have to take a bus an hour away to the nearest grocery store, right? So it's maintaining that. It's looking at funding mechanisms. It's been an interesting time to be a transit planner and transit scheduler working with communities, because my basic objective has been flipped on its head, right? So previously it's how do you maximize the number of people that can take transit, the amount of ridership, right? And now it's like, okay, whoa. We're trying to find the sweet spot with, keep the frequency, make sure that it's, it's a positive experience, that you can connect people from home to wherever they need to go, but then also don't put too many people on that bus. And so if the basic funding mechanism has not been changing to address that, then you're somewhat forcing transit systems to make really hard choices.
So Tania, what would you do?
What would you do?
What would you do? How would you change the financing mechanism?
Well, I think one of the things right now, just over the interim, over the shorter period, is, in the United States and the United Kingdom, we have seen the federal government step up and offer funding towards transit agencies. And that is something that Canadian transit systems have been asking for here, right? So that would be a short-term mechanism. The other piece is, okay, what are we looking long-term in terms of how we are funding transit?
Can I just clarify what you're suggesting here? You're saying at the moment there's a gas tax that does transfer to the municipalities, and the municipalities make allocations, and the province is involved in funding transit. Are you saying that you would want to see the federal government find some way to get money directly into transit authorities?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. Like you can either, I mean, the trade-off, right now is you can pay transit workers who may be laid off, right? Or you can pay them to keep transit systems.
Okay, wait. So you're saying potentially another way to do this would be to make, we have a wage subsidy at Timothy that was introduced after during COVID,
Right.
where the government is paying a wage subsidy. And I think what Tania's suggesting is, why wouldn't you extend that wage subsidy then to transit system employees? And so that subsidy would be offered directly to the employee, and then they could potentially come back to work and maybe their salary would be topped up by the authority. Anybody else have a sense here about financing options going forward? It's a huge
and can I just, one other thing that has been floated, one other idea is that, you know, there has been one of the tricky points of transit, right? Unlike a bike lane or sidewalks, which are amazing and we need to keep doing it. And that's part of it, is we need to keep doing it all and maintaining that diversity to our transportation network. But one of the differences is that sidewalks, bike lanes, they're capital, right? They're one-time infrastructure. For transit, it's the operating costs ongoing. And that's the thing, transit is about people. It takes a lot of people to operate a system, which in turn are local jobs within that community, and which in turn is helping communities function by getting people to where they need to go, whether they be essential service workers or whether they be other people trying to access goods and services and appointments. So up until now, there's always been reluctance or somewhat reluctance from senior levels of government, depending on the jurisdiction, to put funding towards operating costs on an ongoing basis towards transit. But normally fund infrastructure, that hasn't been the same. There's been more openness. So one of the other ideas is whether on a short-term basis, whether there might be an opportunity to relook at reallocating some of that funding, as long as you know that generally you're going to need that infrastructure funding at some later date. But anyway.
So, yeah, Ahmed, what do you think in terms of the sustainability of this? And then I want to talk a little bit about, you know, the issue around how we're going to negotiate shared space, public space for transit or whatever, or walking. But Ahmed, any thoughts from your point of view in terms of how can we create sustainable mobility systems in the post-COVID era?
Yeah, funding is a major issue, and you have to take some bold decisions in terms of funding. So on funding public transportation system, you might need to open the can of worms that's named congestion pricing. You have to start getting people to you when they're using cars to pay for the real cost they are doing on the ground. It's not politically famous, or so that's why we go to get money from the federal government to pay for the operations till we can figure this out. London, UK, he went and he expanded it. He said, okay, we're going to get the money from there and we'll get this. We need to start, if we are trying to get people to jump on bicycles, we know that we're sprawling anyway. And in order for me to jump on a bicycle for a 20-kilometer daily commute, I need an electric bike, for example, if I'm not that fit. So as you're subsidizing the electric cars, start considering subsidizing the electric bikes to get people on bikes for the longer distances. It increases the catchment area dramatically if you do that. But to get the money for these subsidies, okay, you have to get it from somewhere. It's a cycle. If we
I always like asking somebody from Quebec, do you think we've got the political will, Ahmed, to do this, to do congestion pricing, to have a different kind of arrangement to how we fund? What do you think? You know, we have a window here, right? The world is broken. It's going to come out in some new form. Window.
Gas tax,
say it again?
One of the things you see in the Montreal public transit budget is that the revenues from the gas tax keeps going down every year. And every year we try to get more from the municipalities. So how much is that pressure? Now the pressure, we're trying to push it back on the federal government, pay us money for the operations. Yeah, they can pay money for the operations to save us for this 3 months, 4 months, whatever, till COVID is over. And then we're going back to, we're having the fiscal deficits and the transit, and we need the subsidy again. So to have a stream of funding, to me, it's congestion pricing. And when is the pressure gonna hit? It will have to happen. At some point, we'll have to get there.
I would see Ahmed's congestion pricing and up him a reallocation of road right-of-way. Like I actually think like some of the modeling that we've done here in Edmonton, so we have a 50% mode share target in our draft city plan, and we've done some modeling to try and understand what it would take to get us there. Pricing driving is one way to do that. Another, and it doesn't have to be just the roads, it can be parking as well. So like really looking at, you know, pricing our curb space appropriately. If that's a like huge public asset, the curb, like how do we price that properly? And sometimes it's just about reallocating road space to privilege the transit and bike users to make that trip more time cost effective, I guess I could say. And so that's another way we could do it. And I saw like a question that came through from one of the audience members, like it kind of privileges people, but there have been some studies that looked at means-based congestion pricing.
Yes.
So I think we can look at different ways that we can do congestion pricing that doesn't have to be a difficulty for people already in need. I actually think congestion pricing is probably one of those things that it's a little bit far off for us to consider. Like, I don't know if most cities would want to go down that route, but I think we can start by looking at our parking prices. We can start by looking at how we manage our curb and looking at how we dispense our right-of-way, which is quite precious.
Tim?
Yeah, I think it's, so this is my bailiwick. So I'm glad we got this subject area. I've actually written an article, just came out a couple of days ago, on the business models and how we finance things. One thing we have to do very clearly up front as agencies is realize that we are over subsidizing the private car ownership model. That is way, way overdone. And we have to then in turn subsidize the transit system and the bike and walk model, because we've made it so convenient and easy to drive in your car around. And that costs us a fortune. We are literally going bankrupt because we're over subsidizing the private car ownership model. What does that mean? Congestion pricing is a dirty word. It's what we call here a political buzzsaw, if you talk about it. But you can break it down, and I think Howaida actually talked about some really key points. Charging for parking at either end of the trip. So you have to learn about use cases and think more like a service. If you have to pay for something at the beginning of the trip, you think about it. The reason why car sharing does such a good job at getting people to give up their cars, because they start learning what the true cost of that trip actually is like. We've divorced the cost of the trip from car ownership, because once you buy the car, you don't care about how much it costs anymore. You want to use it as much as possible. When you actually have to pay per trip, per service, you start thinking about, is this the right mode for this trip? Can I get there in another way? And if we can utilize the technology we have today to actually charge the use of the curb. If a large car that's heavy and polluting is stopping at a particular curb, they should pay more than someone who is actually riding a bicycle or a shared mobility service that's using up less space, has no emissions, and is not a safety issue from a collisions perspective. All those bundle subsidies make it really easy to always choose your car keys and drive. And the same reason why we have to subsidize public transit so much. If transit has its own dedicated lane, and if we are now paying the true cost of driving, all of a sudden transit starts making a lot more sense, and it makes more work. From a city perspective, when I was the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of San Francisco, we developed a 50-50% mode share target in 2013, and we met it by the end of 2015 because we'd done all those specific tools to get us there. We'd charged for parking, we'd made it easier for public transit and for walking and cycling and everything else. And what we did though is we changed the narrative about how much things cost. We don't talk about how much things cost in transportation at a larger policy perspective. And the example I'll give you is, the MTA that I used to work with had a $1.2 billion budget. People say, well, it's a lot of money for public transport, that's just too much money going to the transit agency. But we had data that showed that 25% of all trips were on public transport, and the other 25% of all trips were walking and bicycling. So half of all the trips were done with $1.2 billion. The other half of all trips were done by car driving, private car driving. Guess how much that cost the city? $4 billion, because we all paid money into our own pocket to drive our own cars. So I can move half the population on $1 billion and the other half on $4 billion. So if we look at the full cost accounting of our transport system, not just the public, but also the private costs, we can now say, look, I can move everybody in a much more affordable way that's more equitable for $2 billion, and we all save money. So changing the narrative around how we fund transport and how we talk about funding transport ends up showing you that public transport and bicycling, public transport is cheap, bicycling is basically free. We should be just focusing on those two things. And we can make, yeah.
Tim, here's the dilemma between Canada and the United States. You're 10 times bigger than Canada, and you've got many, many, many cities that would have the values and the circumstance that you're describing in San Francisco. Canada has a fraction of the population, and it has maybe 5 cities that would have, to varying degrees, the same level of commitment and sensibility that you're suggesting. We have gazillions of Canadians living in suburban communities, and
so
they are car dependent, right? So I don't know how they're going to respond to, and it's very difficult at this time to suggest anything that is going to make people less comfortable, disadvantaging them. People want to be comforted and supported at the moment in Canada. They don't want to be told that they won't be able to do things. Go ahead, Tania.
They won't. They won't, because guess what? When cities go bankrupt and transit go bankrupt, then there's nothing. So we have to be uncomfortable, I'm sorry. And the time to talk about, we talk so much about equity, but this is the time to talk about justice. You know, we need transportation justice. Equity is making sure everybody has some access to it, but we need to bend that over so that we can correct these problems. And if we can't talk about it now and get a little uncomfortable, then the outcome of what's going to happen is basically a bifurcated system where the haves and the have-nots literally separate their lives, and we have parallel universes. I don't want us to go there. We should have to go there. And countries like Canada, and I mean, I was born in Australia, they've got social safety nets. The US doesn't even have a social safety net. So we have to talk about these things and get a little uncomfortable so that we can all become more comfortable in the future.
Okay, Tania.
Just in terms of, well, how do we do it and what makes it happen? One of the kind of tongue-in-cheek sayings that I have that I use a lot in my own practice is that you can get away with almost anything if you call it a pilot project.
Right.
And
we're kind of in a global pilot at the moment.
Well, we're in a little bit of a global pilot. And though it is, so, you know, we've been talking about, okay, well, where are we at? One of the things that I am seeing and appreciating about this moment is how fast change is happening, how people are adapting, how they're experimenting, how they're trying stuff on. When you start looking at the slow streets that are being put in and the increase, it's like, okay, urban tactics are just going out there quite quickly. And the same is true for transit. And I think, how do we embrace that as well? So more and more communities are kind of starting to see, to take more of a hierarchical approach to their transit system in terms of the routes, not in terms of equity and who rides, but in terms of using different layers of service for different contexts. And so how do we keep building on that to put the frequency and the service where it's needed? How do we play around at the edges with demand responsive services or different approaches to make it all?
Yeah.
So I guess it's like, how do we use this moment where there is maybe a little bit more leeway to experiment with trying things that we can try for a time limited point and see what happens from there.
I hope I can put a call out. I want to put a call out to, we start looking for suburban experiments, that we start hearing. Graham Wilson's just said, look, suburban white collar workers and car commuters are staying at home. Maybe there's a chance to try some different stuff. You know, Are we going to do more amenity? We've got a whole project on bringing back Main Street, and Main Street exists in burbs too. So is there a way for us to, I am still stuck on Tim's thing. I stay home so others can get to work. Maybe I stay local so other things, other people get to work too. Okay, Ahmed, we're in the sort of home stretch here. Closing comments from Ahmed and Howaida. Let's just hear where you guys are thinking as we round the end here.
Yeah, if you want to stay local, we need to start rethinking our zoning and our suburbs and the land use part. You want to make sure that you can do everything. So going back to what's happening in Paris, when she was the mayor she was running by the 15-minute city. She wanted everything to be within 15 minutes from the place. So we have to start, in order to do that, either you can get people go faster or bring things nearer to each other. So you have to change the land use. So you have to play with both. In the right now, what we can play with, we have been playing with the transport much with the COVID thing. We have been trying in Montreal, what they tried to do a blanket of the bicycling facilities all over the city to make sure it's equitable for everybody to get from point A to point B, but they're suffering in the finances of that, and who is gonna pay for it? The federal government is saying, yeah, do it, but they're not putting money in. Operate the transit, but we're not putting the money in there. So we have to start rethinking many things we're doing. And I think it's an opportunity to start pushing for bold things now. And as Tania is saying, we can name it pilot and do it, you know, so and get things through. So then we can, and because that's why they named it temporary bicycle facilities in Montreal. And hopefully if people likes it, it will be permanent down the road.
So we've heard a cri de coeur from Tim, now or never. We've heard Tania say, let's make it the global pilot. And Ahmed is suggesting maybe some of these things will stick. Last word to you, Howaida. Talk to us about the reality on the ground in Edmonton.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Ahmed. I've had this conversation with my planner colleagues for years. It's about, like, you know, transportation. Most cities can control that. We own, operate, and manage our transportation system. Not the same with our land use. Our land use we have to influence. But I would suggest that we have been very reticent to influence, to use the words growth management, to try and, you know, we could be accused of influencing the market or trying to make changes in the market. However, those are the kinds of things we're going to have to think about. And in our draft city plan, we talk about a growth management system. We talk about the 15-minute district. I love that big cities like Montreal, Toronto put out those big ideas, because cities like Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, we can start thinking about those things too and dream about them for our smaller cities as well. So in my opinion, we need to start having a little bit of more bravery around saying words like growth management, and really thinking about rezoning and enabling the kind of districts, communities that we need to live locally.
You know, we really want to get to the practical in these sessions as we go, or as the weeks carry on. How do we go from what we want to see to actually making it happen? So last comment to you, Tim, because we always want to hear from San Francisco as we finish. Last comment to you.
I think the idea is that, you know, this is our time to change things. We've learned from our mistakes. We know what needs to be done. We just need to get the gumption to do it. And the idea is pilot until you have to. And we just need to get it done because there's not enough time. And this is just the prequel to the big gorilla coming down the road, which is climate change. So we need to get things going now.
That's right. Life is not a dress rehearsal. On that hopeful and I think compelling note, I want to thank everybody for joining us on City Talk, and for you for sharing with us your perspectives, your unique perspectives, and what you've been seeing on the ground and what you're anticipating are the real pressing challenges we have to address. You've been very provocative. We could have kept you here a lot longer. Thanks for all the folks on the chat. So many good comments. We'll, as I suggested, we'll publish all of this. And 2 days from now, Thursday, it's still City Talk on Thursday, where we're going to talk about public art, public space, and what the future of that kind of land use looks like. The relationship, as you suggested, Howaida, between land use and, boy, you guys gave us a whole week of things to think about. So thank you so, not just weeks. Thanks very much for joining us on City Talk. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Bye, everyone.